Hello, everyone. It's been just a little while since the last episode of the Strenuous Life podcast, and I apologize it's taken so long. There have been a whole bunch of things going on. They're all interconnected in some weird way. Number one, I prepared for and then executed a solo expedition up in Nunavut. Nunavut, it's above 60 degrees latitude. It's getting pretty close to the Arctic Circle. It's the Arctic. So a long solo canoe trip up in the Arctic. That was one thing. Another thing is my book about my previous long solo canoe trip in the Arctic called Perseverance, Life and Death in the Subarctic, got picked up by a publisher, and I've got a publishing deal, and it's coming out in early 2025. So that's really exciting, but that took a whole lot of finagling. And thirdly, I've been preparing and working on and studying how to teach my next jiu-jitsu instructional. And these things are all combining in really weird ways. So on today's podcast, I'm going to talk about how those things combine. I'm going to go over the trip a little bit. I'm going to review it. And then I'm going to go over the big lessons that I learned on this trip and actually how they apply to jiu-jitsu and other physically strenuous activities. So how do all these things connect? Well, I got this publishing deal. It's with Pegasus Books, which is distributed by Simon & Schuster. So that's a big deal. And in the publishing industry, you live and die by your pre-sales. The more books you sell before it actually comes out, the better it's going to do. It's a signal to Amazon. It's a signal to the book retailers that this book is actually popular. So I'm trying to do everything in my power to get as many pre-sales as possible. And I was going to do this two ways, primarily. Number one, by doing what I called a book tour, by doing another trip in very similar territory and then sharing it on my social media and kind of raising awareness of that aspect of my split personality, right? I've got Stephan the martial artist, the jiu-jitsu guy primarily, Stephan the firefighter, and then Stephan the adventurer. So this is kind of a merging of a couple of those areas. And to incentivize pre-sales, what I'm going to offer is that if you go out and look up either at Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Indigo, or go to a independent bookseller and you pre-order Perseverance, Life and Death in the Subarctic by Stephan Kesting. If you pre-order it and then send a copy of that receipt to support@grapplearts.com, you'll get my next jiu-jitsu instructional for free. I figure that most people listening to this podcast do jiu-jitsu or are interested in jiu-jitsu. So if you're even interested in jiu-jitsu, go pre-order the book now. Email a copy of the receipt to support@grapplearts.com, and when the next instructional comes out, hopefully in a month or a month and a half, you'll get that entirely for free. This is a $30 book in US dollars, and the instructional is going to be roughly a $100 instructional. So you're getting a $100 instructional and a book for price of just the book. So that's a damn good deal. So go and do that now. And not only will you get the book, will you get the instructional, you'll have my undying gratitude. So it's funny how all these things are converging. Let's review the trip I did a little bit. If you're interested in kind of a day-by-day account, I posted it on my social media and also at my site that I use for my wilderness stuff. Now, obviously, my main site is grapplearts.com, and that's where I post most of my content and most of my stuff relating to training and jiu-jitsu and martial arts and mindset. But the outdoor stuff I tend to post on a site called essentialwilderness.com. So if you want a day-by-day account and maybe go along through that as you're listening to my mellifluous voice talking about these things, go to essentialwilderness.com, and in the first couple of blog posts, if you're listening to this in a timely manner, you should find an account of that trip with tons of pictures and some pretty cool pictures. So I've been planning this trip for a long time, and I don't think it's possible to understate how much preparation there is in planning a trip that's long to a really remote location and that's by yourself, because every single thing needs to be thought through. Ultimately, if you go by yourself, you are responsible for everything and everything's your fault and everything should be within your control. So for example, putting together the medical kit, that was a big deal because I had to go talk to my doctor and discuss all the various things that could happen and, people were suggesting that I take things like tourniquets or uh, hemostatic gauze. And that's not stuff that I took. I mean, honestly, if a bear chomped my arm off and I somehow managed to tourniquet myself, which is doubtful because normally you apply tourniquets to other people, it's not like I can call 911 and then get picked up by an ambulance 30 minutes later. Getting out of there would be 1, 2, 3, 4 days process, by which point, sure, you've got a tourniquet, but there's still blood loss and there's still shock, and you're probably going to die. So really, it turned out that most of what I had to take was a magic assemblage of antibiotics just to cover every single kind of infection or physical ailment that could happen. But that takes time. You have to do your research and figure out which medications you're going to take. You have to talk to your doctor. You have to go to the pharmacy. You have to figure out your repair kit because you have to be able to repair everything from your tent to your paddle to your canoe to your clothing to your bear alarm to your communications equipment. It's a lot of forethought, and every additional thing that you add is more weight for you to carry, which slows you down, which increases the chances that something's going to go wrong. And then, of course, the food preparation, that was a massive undertaking. I shared a bunch of photos and videos of the drying and dehydrating and mixing that I did on my Essential Wilderness Instagram. So if you want to check that out, that's again another snapshot into that other aspect of my brain. And that took a lot of time and it took a lot of thought, and I screwed up on certain aspects of it, which I'm going to talk about. Even getting to the starting point was a massive undertaking. It was a 3-day drive, about 2,000-mile drive, followed by a 4.5-hour taxi ride out to the end of the road, the literal end of the road. It doesn't go any further north. Then a 2-hour bush plane flight further north to within about 60 miles of the Northwest Territories boundary and the tree line. So I landed in the forest. And so even getting to the adventure, there was an adventure before the adventure that was quite challenging. I actually left directly from the fire hall. I did a night shift, got up early, had my guy come in early to relieve me, and then basically took off my firefighting helmet and put on my outdoor hat and started driving west. Started driving east from the west coast to get to my starting point, which was Lynn Lake, Manitoba, tiny town, a couple hundred people, mostly abandoned now that the local mine has shut down. Everything's boarded up. It really is the end of the world. And it's just a starting point for me getting to the actual end of the world or the middle of nowhere. So the trip ended up being 19 days long. I started where I wanted to start and I finished where I wanted to finish, but the route that I was going to use to connect those 2 points changed significantly, and I'll go into that a little bit. The population of this area is incredibly low. I didn't pass any towns. I didn't see anybody on that entire journey. I think it took 19 days, except on the first day. There's an abandoned fishing lodge that's in a beautiful place on a stunning lake called Newton Lake. And there were 4 guys there who were working to repair it and get it back up to snuff and to turn it back into a functional lodge. So I landed thinking I was completely alone, and a few minutes later a motorboat drives up and they're just checking out what's going on. So I ended up staying there for the night and actually helping them build a dock that they were doing. They were repairing a dock so they could fly a float plane in to bring more supplies to repair everything else. And so that was a quite unexpected beginning to the trip. I did not expect to be eating cheeseburgers and fries cooked by somebody else on the first night, or eggs and bacon cooked by somebody else the next morning. But there was a little interruption, and then I headed off. I assembled my boat, which was a folding boat, so called a pack boat, which is a aircraft aluminum frame with a thick, almost like raft type skin. If you've ever gone whitewater rafting, it's that thick vinyl material that's stretched over the frame. So it's actually kind of a traditional build. It's kind of like the animal hide stretched over a wood frame, canoe or kayak that the native people used to travel there with, or a birch bark canoe, which is again a birch bark skin stretched over a wood frame. And I started out on a gigantic lake called Newton Lake. This is 150 kilometers, roughly 100 miles south to north. It's up to 40 kilometers, or call it 25, 30 miles across at times. It's so far that you can't see the other shore. The bottom part is in the trees, so it's forest. But then as you paddle north, the trees begin to fade out and you end up in tundra pretty quickly. So tundra is, the very, very low shrub vegetation and maybe some stunted spruce trees and a few stunted larch trees, usually right at the water where it's a little bit sheltered from the wind. And these trees might be 5 foot high, 10 foot high. And then as you go further north, those fade out as well. So Newton Lake is a trip. It's a beautiful lake. It's also incredibly windy. And right off the bat, I was hit by really strong winds and spent a lot of time windbound, including in some high bear density areas. So I did run into a black bear there. I was out looking around, walking around, and saw a black bear on kind of the next ridge over. It's a very estuary, sandy shore, because it's where the glaciers that were there 8,000, 10,000 years ago dumped out all their sand as they retreated. And so I was on one ridge, and there's a little valley, and then a ridge over. So I was watching this black bear, and then he smelled something and turned and started coming towards me. And then I fired off a shotgun blast into the air and started yelling like an idiot, and the bear ran off. So that was fun. It's actually the only bear that I encountered. There were lots of bear tracks, so I know that there were grizzlies around, and there were definitely polar bears around at the end. But sort of fortunately and sort of unfortunately, I didn't run into any more. Newton Lake is gigantic, and like I said, there's wind. But in the northern part of it, there's also ice. And this is hundreds of square miles of ice. And it kind of drifts around the lake. If there's a gentle wind from the east, all the ice goes west and piles up on the shore. And I was actually camped on the shore when the ice started to pile up. And it's really impressive how it can go from the ice being 50 feet offshore to a couple of minutes later, it's right up against shore. And there's this crunching sound as if 1,000 glass chandeliers are being dragged across rocks. And then the ice starts building up, and you start going, oh, well, I sure hope the tent is pitched high enough and the canoe's out of the way enough to not get crushed by these many millions of pounds of ice that are just drifting around. So navigating the wind and navigating around these ice flows and these giant sheets of ice was really quite tricky, and it took up a lot of time. So when I finally got to the north end of the lake, I was really quite far behind schedule, which meant I had a choice to make. I could either continue the original route, which was a bit longer, and also included several more large lakes, which had proven to be such a problem, and also included some smaller rivers, which had a lot of whitewater on them, and then turned into larger rivers down towards the ocean. Or I could continue on a somewhat larger river, which had the lakes on which were generally smaller. And I had to choose the somewhat larger river with the smaller lakes. The canoe I had, because it has a little bit of flex, would dive down into the water, but it wouldn't submerge in the water. It kind of ride up and over the waves. So it was really good in large whitewater. But that flex meant that it was slower in the wind and slower in the waves. And I didn't know if I went the original route that I had planned, if I'd run out of food. And if you get stormbound for a couple of days and then you're just progressing really slowly, it's quite possible to run out of food and be trapped on the tundra. And if it's real stormy, it's not like you can call a helicopter or float plane to come pick you up. They won't be able to get you. So I decided to go the plan B route, which was interesting because I didn't have good maps for that area. I had a very large scale maps. I had 1 to 250,000 maps, but in a place where the river is not as defined as people think of rivers. If you think the Mississippi and you start at the beginning of the Mississippi, you can go down the Mississippi because it's this big river, it's generally moving, and it's a clear bank on one side and a clear bank on the other. And if you stay in between the two banks, you're going to get down to the Gulf of Mexico. It's not like that on the Canadian Shield. The Canadian Shield is a really rocky area without a lot of soil. So the river might go west and then turn into a giant lake, and the exit to that lake might be 270 degrees away from the direction that you came in. So if you just continue across the lake, you're never going to get to the exit. And you might well spend a week searching for the exit of this river out of just a broad section of water. And that was quite challenging. I used a combination of dead reckoning and guessing and looking for little clues in the waves and looking for little clues in the if there was any movement at all in the current, using the 1 to 250,000 topo maps, and then also using my Garmin, which is a GPS unit, which is good, but if you zoom out to get the big picture, all the little islands disappear and you're navigating by the islands. So I actually don't like navigating off of a GPS at all. And if you sync it with your phone, well, that's cool. Now you get better vision, but you're now chewing through the batteries much faster. And if it gets cloudy and your solar panel breaks, or if it gets cloudy and your solar panel doesn't work, or if your solar panel breaks, then you're screwed. Now you don't have enough electricity to charge your devices. And it turns into this complex sort of cycle of like, what's the minimum amount of GPS that I can use? So I continued down the river. It was really beautiful. Again, I didn't see anybody at all. I did end up seeing some caribou. I missed the main migration. I found out later that the caribou herd, the giant caribou herd of thousands of animals, was about 50 kilometers north, so 30 miles north of the river at that time. So I basically went underneath them, and that's too bad, because if you catch the caribou herd, that's one of the most meaningful or one of the most stunning experiences you can have in the Canadian North. I did manage to catch the peak of Blackfly season, which was quite impressive. A large river like that can produce 1 billion blackflies, that's with a B, per kilometer per day. And a square meter, they've measured it in a square meter, just a little bit larger than a square yard. They've found up to 600,000 blackfly larvae. And there's a lot of square yards in a large river. So almost 0.6 million blackfly larvae per square meter. It's nuts. So yeah, a lot of the time I was living in a mosquito net. Bug spray doesn't work nearly as well against blackflies as it does against mosquitoes. Pretty much everyone's familiar with mosquitoes. Not everyone's familiar with blackflies. They're much smaller. They're little bulldogs. They land, say, on your shoe, and they'll crawl up underneath your pants, and they'll start biting. I still have scars on my legs from that. And I would spend a considerable amount of time in a bug net each day, just a net that zips up over my face. And to eat food, especially in the evenings, which would take a little bit longer, I would have to light a fire and then sit directly in the smoke. And the smoke confuses them, keeps them away, and also the cold confuses them. And it got cold. I mean, there was still ice on the lake, so that's a little bit cold. And then there was frost on a couple of days in the middle of July. And that was lovely, actually, because it meant that for a couple of hours the blackflies were dormant and I could eat without a net. I could walk around. It was awesome. I'm going to talk about the whitewater later in terms of things that I learned on this trip, because I think that applies directly to training. The ending of this trip was one of the sketchiest things I've ever done in the wild. It was really much more of a near-run thing than I would like. So I'd previously been talking to a couple of Inuit hunters who were going to come out and pick me up. I'm coming out onto Hudson Bay. Hudson Bay is gigantic. Hudson Bay is like 600 miles across. If you get washed out into the middle of Hudson Bay, you're dead. Hudson Bay at this time of year, mid-July, still has tons of icebergs. Hudson Bay also has 5-mile tidal flats and 10 to 14 foot tides. So it's a huge current going out when the tide is going out and a huge current coming in when the tide is coming in, put on top of frequent storms. And put on top of that, Hudson Bay in the winter is all covered in ice, and you have polar bears hunting for seals. In the summertime, when that ice more or less melts, the polar bears all go to the shore. So the shoreline of Hudson Bay is the densest polar bear aggregation in the world. There are more polar bears there than anywhere else. On previous trips, I've seen 5 polar bears in an hour and a half and 14 polar bears in 24 hours. That's a lot for a hyper-carnivorous animal that's the size of a dining room table. They're gigantic. They only eat meat. They can be super grumpy in the summer. They're fasting, except for when they find a dead seal or an errant canoeist. And they're grumpy and they're waiting for that ice to form again. And as the climate up there warms up, the ice-free period becomes longer and longer. So they have to go longer between meals. And that doesn't make them happy at all. And so Hudson Bay coast is extremely sketchy. I've paddled it a couple of times and I've been terrified the entire time. So this time I was coming out, the Fluviaza emptied out into Hudson Bay. Arviat, the town I wanted to go to, is about 40 miles north of the mouth of the river, 60 kilometers. And I'd hired a couple of Inuit hunters to come out in their 18-foot aluminum boat to pick me up at the end of the trip and shuttle me up to Arviat. So far, so good. And using the messaging function on my GPS, I could talk to those hunters when they were on their cell phones in Arviat, the town, a couple thousand people. It's a beautiful little town on the coast of Hudson Bay, really quite clean, well organized, super friendly. I'm really impressed by the towns that I've been on the Hudson Bay coast. The trouble is, as soon as those guys got in the boat, for whatever reason, their Garmin units would not talk to my Garmin units. So I got to the coast and I went to the pre-agreed place, which was a shack, an old shack. 2 of the walls had long since been ripped off. So it's a roof and a couple of walls, a little bit of shelter from the wind, a tiny bit of shelter from the bears, not really much because they can just go around and come through the open walls. And that's where we were supposed to meet. And I sent them a message saying I'm at the cabin after the previous day, saying I'll be at the cabin at this time. They had gotten to the river and been unable to go up it. They'd been unable to cross the intertidal because the tide was too low. So they sent me a message saying, hey, we are anchored out at sea at XYZ location. Send a GPS location. Come out and meet us. But they didn't get my message and I didn't get their message. So they're sitting out there in the boat twiddling their thumbs, and I'm sitting at the cabin walking around carrying a 12-gauge shotgun and bear spray waiting for them to show up. And they didn't show up. And it's like, that's not, from everything I've heard, these guys were reliable. The hunters understand that canoeists it's not the safest place in the world to hang out. So after a couple of hours, I was like, who do I know who might know these guys? And it's like, I know the mayor of Arviat. So I texted him with my satellite messaging function on my Garmin, saying, hey, do you know Daniel and this other guy? Do you know their Garmin? Can you tell them that I'm at the pickup place? Unfortunately, my friend, the mayor of Arviat, was traveling for work that day. And so he didn't have a lot of time. He had to get onto planes. So he's busy messaging them, and they let him know that they're parked offshore. And that gets relayed back to me. It's like they couldn't come in, just paddle out from shore. They're there, paddle far from land. I have to go. So that was kind of the last transmission. And so this is a very large river mouth. It's probably widens out to 6-7 miles across, 10 kilometers across. And then the intertidal is another 5 miles out. So it's a very large area. It's roughly 6 miles by 5 miles. And it's full of giant boulders, every one of which looks like a car or a boat. And you're viewing this from 2 or 3 feet above the water. And there's some waves which make it hard to see at a distance. Furthermore, there was a strong wind, there was a strong offshore current, and a storm was coming in from the south. And as I paddled out to look for these guys, I was like, this is how people die. This is not a good situation. This is how people die, and I don't know what the better solution is. If I don't try and find these guys, are they going to come back tomorrow? I don't know. Then I'm stuck trying to paddle the Hudson Bay coast to RV it on my own. That's probably just as dangerous. So I was climbing onto rocks and firing off my shotgun into the air. They never heard it. A shotgun is loud. But they were also firing their rifle. So I'd heard this cracking sound from pretty far away, but the wind carried it to me, kind of distorted. I was like, that's probably a rifle. I'm probably going the right way. And after 3 hours of looking for them, paddling against this insane wind, and being pretty freaked out the whole time, I finally saw the boat. I've never been so glad to see a boat in my life. And then we went up to RV it, 40 miles an hour, banging across the ocean, dodging ice floes. And I've never been so happy to check into a hotel in my life. And then it was a beginning of like a 4-day journey home. Anyhow, that's an overview of the trip. If you want a day-by-day description, some photos, you can always go to essentialwilderness.com. And if you want the book version of this, of a longer trip that was arguably more difficult, go and pre-order Perseverance, Life and Death in the Subarctic, and then email me that receipt to support@grapplearts.com, and you'll get the next instructional for free. Now, let's talk about the lessons that I learned that are applicable to jiu-jitsu training and really applicable to anybody who's trying to push their body. And the first thing I want to talk about is injury prevention. Now, on previous trips, I've experienced quite a lot of back pain, just sitting all day. So being in an upright position where you don't have a backrest and you're sitting all day, and then you're applying torque through your spine, 20,000, 30,000 paddle strokes at a time. And the better your paddling technique is, the more spinal rotation you're using. This has really irritated my back in the past, and it's made those trips beautiful but painful. And that this is a pre-existing back injury that I had that flares up. So what I did for this was a whole lot of proactive strengthening. I've said before, I'll say it again, if you have an injured body part, you should try strengthening it. I'm not a physiotherapist, I'm not a doctor, but it's my experience that most of the time, when I intelligently strengthen around an injury, that injury gets better, the pain diminishes, and the odds of re-injuring it go down. I'll call it maybe 80% of the time. So I did an awful lot of strengthening of especially the posterior part of my body, the spinal erectors, essentially, the muscles that run up and down the back. And the position in which I was doing it is important too. It's kind of a sport-specific thing. When you're paddling or kayaking, you're essentially sitting on your ass with your feet out ahead of you. It's like you're doing the beginning of that stretch where you're stretching forward to touch your toes. So, what strengthening position simulates this sitting position? I decided it was things like stiff-legged deadlifts and Romanian deadlifts, because you're keeping your legs more or less straight when you do that, and you hinge forward at the hips. You're not moving the spine. You hinge forward at the hips. And the position of maximum tension on your posterior chain is when you're bent over with your hips at 90 degrees. So you're getting stronger from the stiff-legged deadlift, say, in the exact position that you're going to need to be in for hours and hours a day. And then I added in some other things like suitcase deadlifts, where you just take a weight in one hand. Take a 80-pound kettlebell, and you stand feet together, and you're bending forward as if you're hinging at the hips. You're not rotating the spine. You're not bending the spine. Putting that down to the ground and back up. So this adds a rotational stress to that deadlifting motion, which simulates paddling pretty well, because in paddling there's a rotational stress. So I did a lot of that, and I also did a lot of core work and sling work, and at least the back pain was much, much less. So it's a successful application, another example of a successful application of strengthening around an injury. So if you have an injury, if you have a knee injury, and you can strengthen methodically and gently in a way that doesn't worsen the injury, try strengthening that. It'll probably stabilize it. If you have a back injury, try strengthening it. Don't overdo it. Don't do anything ballistic. It's not the time to start working on your clean and jerk or super dynamic exercises, but if you slowly and intelligently try strengthening your back, starting small, working up, then the odds that that'll help your injury are pretty high. And if it makes it worse, if it starts getting worse instead of better, then stop. And the other thing I did was modify my paddling technique. I'm not going to get too into the nuances of what I changed, but good paddling technique typically involves rotation, and I started including more of a forward hinging motion. So it's using your body still to power the stroke, but using less rotation. This is directly analogous to jiu-jitsu. In your 20s, maybe you're super flexible and you could escape every position using a high leg, right? Bringing your outside leg up and over the guy, and because you put your foot behind your own head, no problem. Now in your 30s and 40s, you might not be that flexible anymore. You're going to have to modify your technique. You still need ways to escape from side control, but they're going to be different ways perhaps, or you're going to need to set up that high leg differently. You're going to need to make more space initially and then just use the high leg as a icing on the cake as opposed to the main mechanism that you're using. You got to modify your jiu-jitsu every 10 years anyway. That comes from Danny Nasanto. Every 10 years, your game's going to be different. And having been in this game for a long time now, I've had to iterate many different versions of my game. So injury prevention and injury rehab involves strengthening, and it also involves modifying your activities so you don't irritate that body part as much. If you can't bridge, then you better get good at shrimping, or you better get good at elbow-knee connection. If you can't, pull all the time, if you can't get a grip and pull on people's sleeves in, say, De La Riva guard or spider guard because it triggers your tendonitis, then you have to develop a different guard. You still need a guard, but it just might not be spider guard. It might be butterfly guard or close guard, or you might switch to training no gi instead of gi. You've got to be prepared to work around your injuries. Second big takeaway from this trip that applies to training and applies in general to doing difficult things. And that's the idea of training your skills in low consequence environments. Let me start with a canoeing example, and then I'll go on and talk about jiu-jitsu. In canoeing, if you're going down a river, you might run rapids. And on this last trip, there were quite a few rapids, including some long and very difficult boat-eating rapids. If you screw up, it's the end of the trip and you might not survive. And then there were a lot of rapids in between that weren't so difficult, but if you're asleep at the wheel or you're really unlucky, something bad could happen. Your boat could break, you could flip, you could swamp, you could wrap your boat around a rock and that would rip it apart slowly. So there are consequences. So the time to develop my whitewater skills is not in the bush, not running rapids when the consequences are so high. If I'm trying something new and then it screws up, I'm really going to pay a big price. And the only way you can get better is by pushing the envelope a little bit, right? Going to the edge of your comfort zone. It's like that cheesy old saying, there's no growth in the comfort zone and no comfort in the growth zone. Cool, but you shouldn't be you're growing outside of the comfort zone when the consequences of something going wrong are so high that you're unwilling to pay the price. So in my case, I wasn't willing to die and I wasn't willing to lose all my gear to get better at paddling while on this canoe trip. So what I did instead is in the previous year, prior to this trip, I knew it was coming, I did a whole lot of it's called play boating, where you take a little tiny canoe, you take a little 10-foot long, 9-foot long canoe, you kit it out with airbags, you have a saddle where you strap yourself in, and then you launch yourself down the river. So these are much more reactive boats. If you take one little stroke, it might spin around 180 degrees. If you flip, you can actually roll back up. You can catch tiny little eddies behind rocks. It takes a lot of skill to paddle these boats, but if you do get good at it, you can really run some amazingly difficult and very, very technical whitewater. And it's also a great opportunity to practice running bigger water because it's a small boat. So a medium-sized wave seems pretty big when you're in a tiny little boat. So you're learning all kinds of tricks like how to go through the waves not quite straight and using the bottom of the hull to deflect a wave and knowing when you need to turn and punch through a curling wave. It's no different from somebody who might be getting ready for an expedition in the mountains, towing a sled or wearing a backpack to do a backcountry skiing trip, to go and tune up their downhill skills by running some black diamond runs at their local ski hill. Right? If they screw up there and they snap a ski or they snap their femur, they're probably going to survive. They're not going to require a super expensive helicopter evacuation. The ski patrol will come, they'll stabilize the leg, they'll take them down, you have to go to the hospital. So the price of failure there is lessened. In playboating, if I completely screw up and wrap my boat around a rock and it explodes, because I'm doing this typically close to town and typically with friends, and typically it's not that far a walk to a road, I can walk out. I can have my friends, paddle down the river and go up to the cliff and lower a rope down so I can climb up. It's not a massively inconvenient thing if I screw up and go for a swim in a river while playboating. My friend is going to catch the boat, I'll swim into the eddy, and I'm wearing a helmet, I'm wearing a life jacket, I'm wearing all the safety gear, I'm wearing a dry suit, so I'm unlikely to die of hypothermia, I'm unlikely to die of a head concussion, I'm unlikely, hopefully, to break anything, I'm unlikely to drown because I've got a great big life jacket on, and so the consequences of failure are lessened. And as a result, I felt really quite comfortable in the whitewater on this last trip. I only had to portage once. It was about a 250-foot stretch that I had to portage in the middle of a mile-long rapid that started out difficult and then just got worse and worse and worse. The other thing all the playboating allowed me to do is kind of boat scout. So that's when you're going down and you're not stopping and getting out on shore. You're just taking a quick look down. You maybe pull over to the side, look, or as you're going, you look, or you pull into an eddy and have a quick look. And you can immediately see where you want to go and where you want to avoid. It allows you to recognize and evaluate the best thing to do from that situation. So, to transfer this over to a jiu-jitsu situation, you could, if you wanted, do all your training through competitions. You could compete once a week, probably, in most large urban centers, or every couple of weeks, and just enter all the divisions. The trouble is, if you're competing, number one, the odds of getting injured per minute of being on the mat are much higher. I've seen some estimates that say 40 times more likely to get injured per minute of being on the mat when you're competing, as opposed to per minute on the mat when you're just training. I think, if I recall correctly, that comes from wrestling, but I could see it being similar in jiu-jitsu. Maybe it's not 40 times, maybe it's 30 times, but there's a massive inflation of risk when you're competing because everyone's adrenaline is hyped up, everyone's moving at super speed, people aren't going gentle on their submissions, they want to crank you, they want to finish. They're not paying nearly as much attention to your safety as a training partner should. The other thing is, even if you don't get injured, the cost of failure in competition is pretty high. If I try out this brand new guard sweep that I saw, and the first time I do it is in competition, it either works, in which case great, but if it doesn't work, you're probably going to pass my guard, go to side mount, and just squeeze the living crap out of me for 5 minutes, or squeeze the living crap out of me, progress your position, and then tap me out. If the results of a guard pass in competition are pretty significant, I might well just lose that match. That's hard to come back from that point deficit, and I might end up getting submitted, and I've gotten one repetition in of the new guard sweep that I want to work. Whereas if we go to more of a gamified training system, which could be as simple as positional sparring, or the more advanced versions are the fuck your jiu-jitsu systems that have been developed by Rob Bernanke, which was discussed in the BJJ Games instructional. You can get lots and lots and lots and lots of reps in against varying levels of resistance, ranging from gentle resistance to pretty high levels of resistance, but the cost of screwing up is minimized. And the simplest example is in positional sparring. If you and I are positional sparring and you're playing past the guard, I'm playing guard retention, if you pass my guard, great, Good for you. All right, now let's go back. So I get to try the guard retention and the guard sweep movements more than once. I'm not, eating your shoulder cross-facing me for the next 5 minutes. So with the right approach to your training, building the right training progression using gamification, using positional drills, using constrained training, it actually allows you to develop a more well-rounded game, because you can look at your game and say, hey, my back control is pretty good, but my pin escapes suck. Great. I've got a game for you. Or you could say, my close guard is great, but my butterfly guard sucks. Great. Let's go right at the problem. I've got a game for you. Or my arm bars are great, but my triangles suck. Wonderful. I've got a game for you. So by focusing in and reducing the cost of failure, it greatly helps your development and training difficult skills in a low stakes environment. The third thing that was the big breakthrough for me on this trip was recovery. The other times that I've been out in the bush, I typically sleep very, very poorly. And sleep is the core of all your recovery. Yeah, I mean, you can take the most roided out guy in the world, but if he's not sleeping, he's going to get injured and he's going to get sick, and all his will to train will disappear. Someone once said that sleep is the first part of training, or the most important part of training, and I couldn't agree more. So on this trip, I really tried to double down on improving my sleep. I think I did 5 different things. Number 1, I tried to have a little bit of a wind down period in the evenings. I didn't paddle till 10 p.m. then try and be asleep right away. I would try and slow down a little bit and go through the motions and try and relax a little bit, maybe read a little bit on my Kindle before going to bed, and it will allow the mind to wind down. Secondly, I really improved my sleeping system. I went for a much thicker sleeping pad. I used to take a super thin hiking pad or sleeping pad that was more designed for hiking when weight really matters. You're canoeing. Doesn't matter as much. So I went a little bit bougie and got a thicker mattress, and that really helped with sleep. I also started taking a few supplements. I started taking magnesium. There's some pretty good evidence showing that a magnesium supplement tends to relax your muscles and tends to help you sleep. I remember being in the hospital once, and I was all buggered up from sepsis, and I've never slept well in a hospital. And they were really worried about my electrolytes, and they gave me this IV full of electrolytes and a huge dose of magnesium. And I went to bed that night at 8 o'clock, got up once to pee, and then slept straight through till 6 in the morning in a hospital, which is basically an environment designed to not let you sleep, right? There's lights, there's machines that go ping, nurses coming and going, there's people yelling. I was dead to the world. So some magnesium, not too much, because if you take massive amounts, that can have some repercussions. And then also some CBN, which is a non-psychoactive cannabinoid. So taking little gummies. I didn't want any THC in it at all, because I really needed my wits about me if my bear alarm, which is a perimeter alarm going around the tent, got triggered. I've had that happen on previous trips. It happened on this trip, although it wasn't a bear triggering it. I think it was a bird that flew into it. Still, I woke up instantly, sat up, grabbed my shotgun, chambered a round, and was out looking for the bear immediately. So I'm satisfied that CBN didn't have any dozy effects on me. Maybe it'd be different for you. So taking 5 or 10 milligrams of that before going to bed really helped. Additionally, it's the north and it's the middle of summer, which means it's not quite the midnight sun, but the sun never really sets. It's kind of like the sun's in the sky and then goes down, dips below the horizon, but now it's a dusky or a dawn type of light. So it never really gets dark. So yeah, I went and got one of those biohacker sleeping masks, the black masks that all the really cool kids wear when they're sleeping. And that really helped. I think the darkness probably helped more than anything else. A couple other ways I optimized sleep. I tried to have a more regular sleep schedule. That didn't always work, because if it's been windy all day and you're windbound sitting on shore and then the wind starts to die around 5 or 6, you pack up and you're on the water by 7, you want to make miles. So if you go till midnight, you go till 1 in the morning. But by and large, I tried to have roughly the same wake up time and roughly the same going to bed time. And certainly in, I call it civilian life or regular life, regularizing the time that I go to sleep and the time that I get up. When I'm able to do that, I sleep much better. And finally, it may seem obvious, but a lot of people don't do this. No caffeine, and certainly no booze before bed. I don't drink at all, so the drinking's not an issue. But the friends of mine who really track their sleep with sleep trackers have noticed that even a single drink after about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it helps them get to sleep faster, but the quality of the sleep is much less. And so if you drink, day drink, don't evening drink. And certainly no caffeine, because the half-life of caffeine is 6 hours in the average person. Some people process it faster, some people process it slower. So let's say you take caffeine at 1 in the afternoon. That means you take 100 milligrams. It's a pretty strong cup of coffee or 1 caffeine tablet. That means 6 hours later at 7 p.m., there's still 50 milligrams active in your system. And 6 hours after that, which is 3 a.m., there's still 25 milligrams of caffeine active in your system. So if you're going to do caffeine, front end load it to the beginning of the day and try not to take it after noon or after 1 p.m. That's tough because that's what a lot of people use to get through their day. But if they take it, say at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, it's probably impinging on their sleep, which is going to make them more tired, and then they're going to be more tired the next day and they're going to need caffeine. So it's a vicious cycle, but if you taper down, you can probably break it. So focusing on that was a big success. What was not actually a success is I did the math after. And although I was pretty good about ingesting large numbers of calories, I wasn't eating nearly enough protein. I'm about 210 pounds, which even a very conservative amount of protein that I should be eating there is, call that 95 kilos. A gram a kilo would be a conservative, it's kind of like for not an active person, would be 95 grams of protein a day. I was probably doing 80. And I was paddling for somewhere between 8 and 14 hours a day and portaging and continuously on the move. So I think my recovery would have been better if I'd been ingesting somewhat more protein. That's an oversight, and I'll have to try that out on a future trip. But all these things apply to your jiu-jitsu training. Are you getting enough calories? And it's tough to know whether you're getting enough calories unless you count calories for a while. And there's tons of apps that'll do this for you, and it's a pain in the ass. But once you do it consistently for a couple of weeks or a month, you can then lay off of it a bit because you have a much better sense of how many calories are in a sandwich, how many calories are in a burger, how many calories are in a cup of yogurt. You'll get more of an intuitive understanding, and you'll be able to calculate your net calories and the amount of protein coming in your system. How much protein is in a burger? How much protein is in a pancake? How much protein is in an egg? How much protein is in an apple? How much protein is in a cup of cooked quinoa? And you'll be able to quickly do your math and, oh yeah, I probably didn't have enough for my body weight, especially when I'm in tough training. Hydration is super important for recovery. Are you hydrating enough? Again, it's easy to wave your hands, go, yeah, I drank a cup of water this morning. My friends, if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. This is why bodybuilders walk around with those 4-liter jugs. It's because if the bloody jug is empty at the end of the day, they know they've drank 4 liters. If they're just drinking occasionally, they don't know if they've drank enough. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. If you can measure it, you can improve it. So hydration, caloric intake, protein intake, and sleep. If you can measure those things, you can improve them. And that applies to doing anything difficult, whether it's an Arctic canoe trip or whether it's getting ready for a tournament, or if it's just getting better at surviving against all those young punks who are trying to take your head off in jiu-jitsu class. I hope this was useful to you. If you found it useful, always drop me a line. Always happy to hear from you. Always happy to get feedback. Next episode, I'm going to get back to talking more about jiu-jitsu and less about my crazy solo canoe trips across super remote areas of the Canadian North.